All right, welcome back, everybody. This is week 6 of algorithmic filmmaking. This might be the last lecture, unless I get some inspiration for next week. I've got an idea of what we'll do, some stuff for next week, but yeah, I don't really know that I'll have a lecture for next week. So you've kind of made it to the end. Congratulations. I will have a little bit of like sort of housekeeping stuff for next week, as well as sort of like just sort of next steps, because this is an async class and many people are watching this sort of at their own pace. So I'll talk a little about, sort of maybe when the class quote unquote ends, and, how to make sure that you've gotten everything you need from the class. So just as a reminder, we've gone through a whole bunch of stuff already this week, or the past 6 weeks, 7 weeks, if you count my break. This week, we're going to do some audio reactive editing and looking at sort of what I would call visual music, which is a common thing in the experimental film world, and something that we can just sort of explore with some tools that I've produced for us. Next week is kind of the overflow week. I'll put a note in Slack to see if anyone has any content or topics they really want me to cover. I have a little bit I will cover next week, mostly around I'm building a little GUI for people to generate good sequences or sort of what they're looking for, that sort of thing. So we'll definitely have that material next week. And I also kind of guess that, like, because of the fact that this is a very async class and lots of people are not necessarily following the schedule week to week, which is fine, there'll probably be some follow-up questions as we go through, and I'll record little videos to sort of respond to that, maybe work on some new tools, that sort of thing. So there will still be content sort of very intermittently after the class is over. So keep an eye out for that. I'll post it in Slack as well as in the syllabus. Class updates, I've had this on here for like 3 weeks now. I am definitely going to have that bonus interview up this week. I'm stuck in a hotel in the middle of nowhere, well, in suburban Boston, but that feels like in the middle of nowhere. So I'll definitely be able to edit that interview together for everyone. So look out for that. Also, the other thing I'm going to post is a little quick tutorial on how to share your video data set with me, as well as your JSON file. Again, only for people that are interested in it, and I will only be sharing it with people in this class. So I'll also post like when it's finished, like how people can access it, that sort of thing. So next week, that'll kind of make sense. We'll see why having a big data set with these sort of tools will be helpful, if you haven't already. But yeah, so I'll share how to do that. I'm still not sure how well it's going to work. We might end up with like 50 terabytes of video data, and NYU might be calling me to ask why I'm blowing up my Google Drive, but we'll see. I think it'll be interesting to see regardless. And I do actually have a data set that I'm building for everyone that will sort of be a bonus material for this class. So keep an eye out for that. All right, so as I said, this week we are going to look at sort of two things. We're going to look at creating rhythms visually, and then we'll look at audio reactive editing. So this is sort of the musical week. So we'll start by just looking at some generating rhythms. I've got some good examples. It's a very common sort of visual motif, especially for experimental filmmakers. So let's look at some inspiration material to start with. So this is an algorithmic filmmaking class, so I feel like I had to include Betty Gordon's An Algorithm. This is, as you'll see, it's a short clip that is sort of repeated and sequenced, and there's sort of this negative version as well as the positive version. And I believe, I haven't really found out the exact sort of like algorithm there that's being used here, but I do think there's some sort of curvature or like a changing sort of sequence. It's not just linearly chopped up and that sort of thing. So also you're watching without the audio. With audio, it's like a numbered sequence as well, so it's very interesting. I should probably just write down the number sequence and see if I can figure it out. See, it's like a Fibonacci or something. I don't know. But a really great early example from the 70s of, optical printing, which I'll show in just a minute what that is, and a really interesting piece. So definitely check it out. Another classic that I have to show, I don't think I've shown any brackage yet in this class, which is amazing, considering how much I tend to show his work. This is a piece from 1987 called the Dante Quartet. This is from his time period where he was doing a lot of painted film. So as we'll see here in just a second, what he would do is he would hand paint cells of film, then he would run them through an optical printer. And what I kind of like about this piece is you'll see that, it's sort of changing pace. So this is sort of a very rhythmic, sort of, I don't know, maybe 4 frames a second, 5 frames a second, then it goes faster. And there's other moments where it sort of starts and stops, that sort of thing. And I think Brakhage is sort of famous for never putting music across his films, because he would say that you should see the music essentially, sort of in like a synesthesia way. Although I don't think he ever talked about it like that. Um, and I mean, you could say what you want about Brakhage. I think sometimes he's full of shit in some ways, but I do think like he really did sort of believe that there was a way to create rhythm using his visual pieces, and whether or not that was really why he didn't choose to put audio to his films, I can't really say, but at least that was his shtick, and he's sticking to it. Last one I want to show in this sort of sequence or section is Rose Louder's bouquets. Sorry if I didn't give you a warning about these being very flickery. Rose Louder's work especially is very flickery. And so the bouquet series from Rose Louder, I believe, are like minute-long sequences. Each bouquet is a minute. And what's really interesting actually about this work is it's all made in camera. So usually what would happen is Rose would actually go out and shoot and actually cover up individual frames of the camera she's shooting, and then 6 months, a year, maybe in the same place, maybe in a different place, she would then go and reshoot in those blank scenes. And this would basically allow her to then create these very interesting rhythms. But again, they weren't done in optical printer, they were done directly in her Bolex camera. And I think this is really fascinating because you do create these very interesting rhythms through this work. And I believe there's some pieces where she would intermingle sort of these flowers. She does a lot of flowers, obviously, maybe why I like her work, but she does a lot of flowers. And then there's also a sequence where it's sort of a boat, and she would describe it as like, because you're doing this intermittent flashing, you would almost see like the boat swimming across a bed of flowers. I don't know if we actually, I personally don't interpret it that way, but I find it interesting that that's sort of how she's interpreting it. So some really interesting work, and we'll look at a technique to sort of interleave two different videos or multiple videos as well in the tutorial section of this week. Okay, so if your eyes are done vibrating, we'll talk a little bit about how we might do this. I tend to find the best way to do this is actually like FFmpeg is not good at doing this directly in the file. There is a thing called shuffle, but I don't really like how it works within FFmpeg, or actually it's just very complicated, I think. So usually the best way to do this is actually to pull apart the video into individual frames, which we've done in the past in this class, and then re-sequence everything frame by frame. Now, the downside of this, as we'll find out when we do our tutorials, is this is quite slow. And it's actually not the resequencing that's slow, it's actually the pulling apart the video. So using FFmpeg to decompose our video into individual frames, especially if we're using PNGs, it's a very slow process. And then putting it back into a video from the frames is also very slow. But the resequencing part is very fast. So you'll find that often like a 30-second video can take up to like 15 to 20 minutes to actually do everything for this process. Not ideal. Maybe I'm just really bad at writing Python or FFmpeg or other things, but it is a little slow to actually do the process. But I can tell you it is much faster than using one of these guys. This is an optical printer. This is what would have been done during the time of Betty Gordon and Sam Brakhage. And these are my demon. There is one of these at Mono Noir in Brooklyn. I hate these things. They are so slow and so a little finicky as well. But what you're seeing here is maybe in the middle of the screen here, you see how this is on a reel. So this is a 16 millimeter film on a reel. And what it does is as it moves forward and backwards, so this is a little sequencer here. It allows you to program in sequences or to just move it forward and backward. You can move it by one frame forward, and then you can program it to then take a photograph. Then it'll move another frame, take another photograph, move backwards, take another photograph, move forward 2 frames, take another photograph, that sort of thing. You can also do, this would be like early After Effects. You can also do sandwiching of multiple layers to create mats and masks and that sort of thing. But this is what people had up until Premiere or early computer software became available. So this is a very, very slow process. It probably takes, 2 seconds to actually move the frame into the next position. I have used these in a couple of my projects, and it is quite painful. So 15 minutes using technology is far, far easier. But this is sort of the precursor to a lot of what we're doing. I've actually even been building a little piece of software that maybe I'll share at some point that actually replicates sort of the step sequencing of an optical printer, and then allows you to basically write the code for these optical printers. Now these guys are set up on like Arduinos, that sort of thing. But also will sort of give us that effect of sort of maybe what Betty Gordon was doing, or even what Rose Ladder was doing, and especially what Stan Brakhage was doing. So that's your history lesson for this class. Be happy you don't have to do this anymore. So when we think about these sequences, as we begin to pull these things apart into frames, we can think about all the different patterns or different rhythms we can create as we generate these frames. So here are just a couple examples of things you could do. So you could take from the very beginning and then jump to the very end, and then jump to somewhere in the middle, very middle, very middle, and you create these sort of like, ping pong effects as you go through these pieces. So what's really interesting here is the technology or the tool itself is very simple, but as you begin to think about how you build up a pattern or a sequence, that's when it gets really, really fascinating and really interesting, and playing with different rhythms. And then the actual content of your film will also play a very strong part in how these things look. So, with a lot of these tools we're doing, where we're finding similar items, say we take a close shot of a person, and the person is in a fairly consistent spot, or maybe use the face detection tool to actually match up faces, and then you could sort of stutter between those two faces, or maybe even jump back and forth as people make different faces, that sort of thing. So there's a lot of options here, and that's what's really interesting. And it's really just like the tool is simple, but what you do with it can be really fantastic and amazing. And then here's another option, right? I didn't share any of Martin Arnold's work, but I think Martin Arnold's work is kind of like this. Maybe I'll post a link to it in our syllabus just so you can watch it. But this would create like sort of a very fast, at the very beginning, it's just going to be a bunch of the same frames over and over again. But every single time it runs in a loop, it will add one additional frame. So as it runs, it gets longer and longer and longer of the sequence in motion. Again, there's endless varieties of how you could do this. This is just one thing you could do to begin to play with looping and begin to play with different effects as you go through these things. So, it might even be helpful to literally just sit down and write out what you want to do. Find a little grid paper and make a little, chart of how you want to work with it. In fact, that's how Rose Ladder works. Now, her drawings are, honestly, I can't really decipher them in a lot of ways. But she has notebooks and endless notebooks of these little drawings, and these are to mimic the effects she's trying to create, or at least create guides for her. Especially if you're, in the case of Rose Ladder, like she's shooting these over years, right? So she might shoot one sequence, and then 6 months later shoots the other sequence. You do kind of need a map to remember what you did, especially for frame by frame shooting. It'd be so hard to figure out like, wait, which of these frames are blank, which ones aren't. And I think this is really helpful to sort of see like how different people kind of approach these things. I'm very interested in what these look like. These almost like waveforms, where maybe it's like slow, fast, slow. Again, you can see rhythm being really built up here. So we'll take a look at a couple tools that allow us to do that I've made for us in this class, but that just it scratches the surface of all the things you could do. And if anyone's interested in, Python sequencing or that sort of thing, I would love to sort of build up a library of different tools to begin to explore these things. What was I even doing here? Oh, this is if we have multiple pieces. So this would be more like a Rose Ladder thing. So let's say we have 3 different video clips. We could take, the first frame of each video clip and do them in sequence A, B, C, and then take the second sequence or second frame and do 4, 5, 6, and then third, and on and on and on and on. Now, one of the interesting things about this you need to think about is this will actually change how our eyes interpret the speed of the motion here. Because what we're actually doing is we are slowing down the film essentially to a third of the speed. So if it were 24 frames per second, you would actually be seeing this sequence at 8 frames a second, but you'd be seeing all 3 of these sequences at 8 frames a second. So you also have to think about how this affects the motion of what you're doing, or how it affects the speed of what you're doing. Another way to potentially do this, if you wanted to interleave 3 videos, would be to do this. this would be, the first frame of the first video, the second frame of the second video, the third frame of the third video, skip 2 frames and then start over. This would actually give you consistent speed. So the speed of your video clip and the speed of the interleaving would actually be the same, but you would end up dropping all of the 2 frames each time. So in this case, one of the things that we talk about with experimental film is like in the film world, film was expensive. So you wanted to like keep as much of it as possible. And that's where you might do something like this to use up all the film you shot. In the digital world, we don't necessarily care about that. We can always get more, but maybe you've shot a couple of things you can't make more of or you can't lengthen. And then in this case, this would be, you might waste your film, quote unquote. So as we look at this in our tutorial time, we will talk a little about like what this means for the length of your piece, because this piece will be, essentially the additive. It'll be how long are all your clips, add them together, and that'll be the length of this piece. Whereas this piece will actually be whatever the shortest length of your shortest clip is, because we're only keeping that amount of film, or frames or video. It's all the same to me at this point, but just keep that in mind that like this does affect speed as well as you begin to play with these things. Okay, so there are 2 editing tools we're going to look at. One is, a couple of years ago, I made this tool called Rhythmic. And this is more like the brackage piece. So the brackage piece you can kind of understand as a linear set of painted frames. And all he's doing is changing the speed of that sequence. Maybe he's slowing some sections down, speeding some sections up, pausing on some sections. So this is sort of linear, but you're changing the pacing. So that's what Vidum does. The recording or the tutorial I have from that is actually from that class. I haven't touched that. I honestly haven't touched that tool in 2 years, even though I think in that tutorial you'll hear me say I need to, and I never did. So if there are updates people want to make to it, like cool, let's figure it out. What I also like about this one is about generating patterns. It's almost like generating like little loops and then building on loops on loops on top of loops, which is kind of an interesting way to work. Rather than like writing out the sequence by hand, like one at a time, you can sort of make little loops and then build up from there. The other one is what's just right now called the Rhythm Notebook. And this is more along the Betty Gordon or Louder style, where we can resequence clips. We can actually say I want from the middle for 12 frames, and I want to jump to the beginning and get 12 frames there. Then I want to jump to the end and get 12 frames. That is sort of taking stuff out of sequence, right? So it's no longer linear. It's now pulling and cutting and pasting and putting things back together. Or the Louder style, which even though she shot that as one roll of film, we can think about maybe doing it with interleaving multiple clips. And again, you might want to play with length, or you might want to play with, the order, that sort of thing. So that's sort of what these 2 tools will do. So I think it's important to keep in mind that like, this is not an all-in-one tool. It kind of, each one does 2 different things, and you kind of want to figure out what makes the most sense for you. But play with them. I think they're really interesting, and I think they're fun, and I think you can make interesting work by kind of figuring out what the rhythm needs to feel like. If you're a drummer or if you're a musician, you might really like this because you'll actually like kind of think about how you can play music with these tools, by sequencing things like you would like a sequencer.
And the other technique we'll look at this week is actually looking at the audio of a file or our clips themselves and actually having the video react to the changes in the sound. And we'll look at a couple different techniques here in this piece. So I'll show you a couple of things that I've done in the past using this technique. There are a lot of people out doing Audioreactive work, so I don't want to go and like show everything, but I'll show a couple things that I've worked on. This first piece is from my friend Abel, who goes by Commuter. This is a piece called Calcifier, and we actually originally made this piece. It's kind of this interesting sort of flip-flop piece of where I had made about a 30-minute long sort of Yule log style sort of video a couple years ago. I then asked him to sort of create a soundscape for it, and then he turned the soundscape into a song that he released. So he sort of cut it down from 30 minutes to 5 or 6. And then a couple months ago, I was like, oh, I should actually just like make an edit to his song. So I took the 30-minute piece, cut it up into different rhythms, tried to sort of follow some of the flow of the piece, and then put together a music video for him. So it has sort of an interesting background or interesting story to it. But if you watch this video, you will notice that in some parts, it sort of is just on the beat, right? It's just sort of cutting what I think we're kind of watching right now, which is like it just cuts every couple seconds sort of on the beat. But there are other parts where it's sort of like, because there isn't really a beat, it sort of like lets the audio flow and maybe does some fade outs, fades ins. And I'll talk a little bit about like why I think that's important in the next couple slides. But check this one out, and you can sort of see actually a very light audio reactive. It's not super like, you know, changes every sort of time a tone changes or that sort of thing. Another piece for me is floral zombification via attention node networks. This one I feel is much more heavily influenced by the audio. Um, I tend to find with a lot of my work, it's hard for me to figure out what the right edit is to a piece. And I tend to set things to music as a way to sort of create an edit. A lot of my work is abstract or other things, and it can feel kind of weird to be like, when do I cut this scene? There's no dialogue to it. So I tend to find working with audio as a good way to generate a rhythmic feel, but also like kind of ties the two things together. So this song by Kid Simple was like really, really like sort of influential in the way I was making this piece. It is highly reactive. Things drop out when sound drops out, like that sort of thing. And I should admit, like I made this sort of manually. It wasn't really built using algorithmic tools, but it was sort of influenced, and I found clips that sort of matched the vibe of different tones. So again, I never want our class to feel like everything has to be fully automated. You can't ever go in and manually edit stuff. I, in fact, encourage it. I think you should go in and add little personal details or more of the human touch into things. So please feel free to do that as a part of this class, and just use the tools as a guidance method, essentially. And lastly, I want to show this piece. All of this obviously works better with audio, but I sort of have turned it off just so I can talk over it. This is like pure audio reaction. So this is from my Scream Scene series, where it would take the scream of a different person and then apply a video effect using that scream. So when the scream is loud in some of these scenes, it's either separating the colors or zooming in or doing other things. Now, this is a little bit outside the scope of this class because we're really not talking about internal video effects. We're more or less talking about sort of using tools to make edits. But I actually will share a notebook on how I did this. I went back and looked at it because I thought I did it 100% algorithmically in FFmpeg, and it turns out it must have been, this was toward the end of Scream Scenes and I was like running out of days. I did it manually. So I have to go back and write some code to actually do that, but it's actually fairly, I don't know, it's not super trivial, but it is fairly easy to do. So we'll take a look at how to do that. One thing I also want to note is for a lot of this stuff, especially for things like this, we're actually editing FFmpeg. It tends to work best with very short clips or shorter clips. If you feed it like a 10-minute long clip, I think the notebook will actually error out because we're trying to write too much FFmpeg code. Because what I'm having to do is like actually writing like every single step sequence into FFmpeg, which is not ideal, but it does work. So also, like a lot of this is coming from that video art with FFmpeg class I taught. So again, if you're interested in this sort of stuff, I highly recommend going back and checking out those tutorials. They're all up on YouTube. Okay, so a couple of techniques we need to think about when we actually do this work. The first is source separation. So one thing is, you're likely just gonna either download a track or buy a track. You're maybe know musicians and you'll get stems from them. Stems are essentially like a thing where you get the original layers of an audio composition. Stems would be awesome. If you have the opportunity to get that from an artist, you absolutely should do it. Some artists do sell their stems, sort of in like a remix package, that sort of thing. But for the most part, you won't really have access to that. So if you don't have access to stems, what I recommend you do is we'll look at a technique called source separation. And the tool we're going to use is from Facebook. It's a library called Demux. And what it does is it takes any audio track you feed it, and it will break that into the drum track, a vocal track, a bass track, and what it calls the other track, which ends up being all the other instruments. So if you have guitar and keyboard, you'll get those mixed together into a track called Other. It tends to be the best track for sort of the melody, but it can be kind of messy. There are other tools out there. I tend to find Demux is still the best, but you might know of other tools, and feel free to do whatever works for you. But the reason we want source separation is because we actually want to be able to isolate individual instruments or individual rhythms or that sort of thing. And we'll definitely look a lot on how to do that and how to use that in the notebook later today. So for example, this is what a waveform looks like for one of your songs. If you ever see a waveform, you can kind of think about these peaks as sort of the loudest parts and the valleys as sort of the quiet parts. So, some tracks might actually, really crescendo up into a very, very loud piece. This one's pretty even throughout. But when we do source separation, what we actually get are tracks like this. Now, this other track, which is the melody track, might not look that different compared to this. But in reality, it kind of is. Like you'll notice actually in this section right here, this is obviously where drums are. And in this case, the drums are dropped out. And this is the drum track. And you'll see the drum track is much, much more rhythmic, but very sort of evenly, steadily. You can sort of see the drums moving through it as you go through it. But you will notice here, the drums get louder through the second part of the track. So again, helpful to sort of visualize this stuff and actually work with it. So for source separation, one thing I sort of pros and cons of this are that it does do a better job than filtering. Filtering is when you sort of try to isolate a particular band or the highs or the lows of your track. And that can help separate out like bass from melody, but it won't filter out stuff like drums. Like this is a really, really cool technique that basically allows you to pull out drums or vocals from a song in a way that used to never be possible. I also find that for me, in the way that I work, the drum track and the melody track and the vocal track tend to be the best. Bass track is sort of whatever. It tends to provide a little bit of rhythm, but like most people aren't editing to a bass line unless the bass line is really prominent. I really like working off of the melody tracks. I think that's the most sort of musical thing that we're aware of, and it means when stuff changes to the melody, like kind of mentally we like connect with that. The other thing I want to mention is it's not perfect. Often your melody track will have a little bit of drum sound in it, that sort of thing. This gets us close enough to be able to do some of the tools we're going to do today, like using this library called Librosa to actually pull out some of the changes in tone or changes in volume, that sort of thing. But it definitely is not perfect, and it's actually been improving over year over year. And I expect very soon it will get even better. But today it's still not perfect, so I wouldn't necessarily like use it for remixing. I guess you kind of could if you like found a way to hide some of the noisiness, but in general, it's good enough for us and what we want to do, but it's not perfect. Other thing I recommend you do is download this program called Audacity. Some of the waveform screenshots you saw came directly from there. It is free, and I think it works across like Windows, Mac, and it just allows you to sort of visualize your waveform. I'll show how to use it a little bit in some of the notebooks we look at this week, in part because I think it's helpful to sort of match what Librosa gives you, which is sort of like a timestamp to actually like figure out if the timestamp matches up with the right audio. One of the problems with these tools is that they can be a little obtuse or like a little bit obscure, and you sort of have to go in and sort of translate them into something that you can then use. All right, so two techniques. The first is just like a beat analysis, right? So we know that most songs these days have a pretty consistent BPM. There's not a lot of like changes in speed or that sort of thing. So one thing you can do is using the library Librosa that we're going to use today will allow you to sort of figure out the BPM of a track, and then you can edit sort of what I would call on the beat, right? So if there's a consistent 1, 2, 3, 4, you can edit on the 1 or edit on the 2 or edit on the 2s and 4s, whatever you want to do. If you're not super musical, like I know a little bit about music, but not as much as musicians or whatever else. Most songs have time signatures, and those time signatures denote that sort of beat pattern, and when whether they emphasize the 1 or the 6 or whatever it is. So most pop songs these days are 4/4, easy to dance to, so it tends to be the default. But there are other time signatures. 6/8 is a common one. 5/4. There's a bunch of them, and if you're not super familiar with that, it might just sort of take a little bit of figuring out, sort of like, oh, should I do it on the 4s? Should I do it on the 5s? That sort of thing. So play with it and see what feels right. Now, one thing I want to note about this technique is it gets really boring really fast, right? So if you take a 4-minute long song, you're just changing out the edit every 4 beats. It's just going to feel consistently repetitive over and over and over again. And if you do that for too long, like people are just going to sort of like turn off. So one thing I recommend is that you only use this as sort of like a baseline, right? It's sort of to set the rhythm, but then you expand on it or change things out or do different stuff. This can also depend on the song choice, right? There are some songs, if you just pull like a rap beat, like, sort of the underlining beat that someone raps over, it's going to be very repetitive and very structural. maybe want to emphasize that, but it's gonna feel kind of like slow or lame as a music video. So you want to kind of play with the tempo and how many cuts you do and where your cuts are. This is just like creating like a 90-minute film, right? We looked at this in week 2 where we saw the duration of a clip and how clips change over time and seeing maybe where an action scene is and there's a lot of fast repetition. You kind of want to think about that as you make an edit as well. So here's an example. We'll go into this a little bit more detail in one of the tutorials, but imagine there's a cut at every one of these red lines. Now, obviously, these red lines are pretty fat, but you can kind of see here that they are in some cases like fairly rhythmic, or there's a lot of space between them. But then at this part of the song, it gets really, really fast and repetitive. Now, this is kind of nice because this ends up being like, almost 2/3 of the way through, which is kind of a nice moment. Again, sort of thing about structure of film. You usually have 3 acts or that sort of thing. So this is kind of a nice edit, and musically, this song I grabbed just happened to have this in it. It worked great. Your song choice does matter. Again, if you choose just like a beat that someone's supposed to rap over, it's going to be very repetitive, and the structure is going to come from the way they structure the rhyming or the melodies or whatever it is. Whereas a more musical quote unquote song is going to build in some of these different sections. So you might want to play with what song you choose and maybe look at some of these visualizations to understand what the edit might look like when you actually work with it. The other technique we'll look at is, unlike BPMs, we'll actually look at the changes in musical notes over time in something more audioreactive. So in general, this is where I would pull in the melody. And this is where, you can sort of see where different notes hit, or like especially with something like, keyboard or piano, this will actually help you extract where those moments happen. We're going to use this library called Librosa, which helps us sort of do all this work. It makes it very simple because it'd be very hard otherwise. But one thing I mentioned, these are called what's called onsets. So onsets is when something changes sort of in the composition that sort of creates that little spike you see in those waveforms. We want to kind of capture those spikes, but not capture too many of them. So by default, the onsets in Librosa I find are way too frequent, and we'll have to play with sort of like getting a better edit out of those pieces. So here's 2 examples. This is 15 seconds of the song that I'm going to use in our tutorial this week. And you'll see by default, this is the default at the top here, there are way too many clips here. Like this is 15 seconds. Some of these might be like 3 frames. So this is going to feel very, very fast and very quick edit. Now, maybe you want something like that, right? So this is kind of like a, to each their own kind of idea. For me, though, I tend to find cuts that take maybe a second or 2 or have a little bit of variation in them feel better. This is nice because it has a nice set of variation, right? We've got some shorter cuts and some longer cuts, whereas this is all very short. And this is kind of where it kind of depends on you and what you want to do with the edit. And you might play with values in order to actually create different types of onsets. So you can imagine what every one of these red lines where a cut is going to happen. And how frequent you want cuts to happen is going to be dependent on sort of how you tweak the variables in these tools in order to get a audio cut that sort of matches what you want it to. So again, song choice matters quite a lot. I would recommend experimenting with different song tracks. There's going to be different moods to them. There's going to be different effects as a part of, just the way in which the song is written, whether there's maybe a lot of plinking piano or it's more smooth. In fact, stuff that's like a little ethereal tends not to work very well with these tools, in part because looking for that sort of spike in the waveform. And if you find something that's really ambient, there might never be that spike in it. So you kind of have to play with it and maybe figure out if there are even ways in which to edit it using these tools. If there aren't, then you can always like open it up in Premiere or Resolve and actually edit it to the track that way. But this is just a nice way to sort of start to look and automate some tools. Another cool trick, which is maybe sort of the brackage trick, I guess, in reverse, is like you can use a song to create an edit and then don't actually use that song in the final output. Now, I wouldn't necessarily recommend choosing a different song to put on it, but maybe you keep it silent, or maybe you add something that's a little more ambient, or maybe it's all voiceover that you add to it. So this is a nice way to create sort of a fake rhythmic edit without actually having to manually do it. And maybe there's a song in your head that you want to play, but you don't want to actually have people like listen to the song. So you want to sort of feel it, but without actually hearing it. Nice little trick that you can always try and see what happens. Okay, so we've got a couple of tutorials for this week. So we're going to look at Vidium, the Vidim tool. Again, this is going to be the exact same tutorial from a couple years ago because I haven't made any changes to it. So take a look at it. Can't Actually, I think the audio quality is pretty good on it. I did check it out, so I think that's good. Then we've got the sort of visual rhythms, so creating different patterns and being able to cut stuff up. And then we've got Audioreactive editing, and then I will do a quick demo on how to use that video effects tool once I finish the notebook, which I need to do this week. So I'll get to that. Yeah, so that's it for this week. Again, I think this is a cool, fun, exploratory week. Choose different clips to put into your sequences. Find different song choices that allow you to sort of play with things. There's a lot of opportunity here. So I think, again, it's a big exploratory week to try out things and see what you make. And if you make something cool, please share it in the Slack channel as always. Yeah, so with that, let's get started. So I'll drop a link to the old Vidim tutorial, and then we'll jump into some new stuff from there. All right, enjoy playing with musical stuff this week. Thanks.